I just wanted to thank the Upper Delaware Council for having me speak tonight. Today, I will be talking about best management practices, or BMPs, for riparian buffers. And I'm really looking forward to getting a chance to talk to you all about that topic. Again, my name is Haley Springston. I work as the Watershed Planning Coordinator for the Rondout-Neversink Stream Program. And just in case you're not familiar with the Rondout-Neversink Stream Program, we are a project of Sullivan County Soil and Water Conservation District, and we work in partnership with the towns of Denning and Neversink, and we are fully funded by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. And we offer grant funding to projects related to ecological restoration, engineering, research, education, and community programming for those applicable within our watershed areas. We also offer consultation and collaboration services for landowners, municipal officials, community organizations, highway departments, etc. But tonight I'll be talking about the BMPs for installing riparian buffers. There are lots of benefits for planting riparian buffers, but here are the main. Riparian buffers have the ability to protect streamside public infrastructure or private property during flooding events. They also can create a healthier ecosystem for native aquatic and terrestrial wildlife. And they also improve water quality and soil health. And when does RNSP install riparian buffers? Mainly my program installs buffers through two of our programs. The first is through the Catskill Streams Buffer Initiative, or the CSBI program, which is what I lead for our program. And the CSBI program is for streamside landowners living along streams and waterways within the Rondout and Neversink watersheds. We also install riparian buffers alongside our large-scale engineered river restoration projects. And here are a couple examples of some riparian buffers that we've installed. This is the Windtune Waters roadside CSBI site, and I designed and installed this planting in the summer of 2020. The photo on the left shows the site before the planting. So it's, as you can see, it's pretty large stone riprap wedged between the west branch of the Neversink River and Frost Valley Road. And I think,
excuse me, Fred, was that armored after one of the floods?
This was armored.
They call armoring?
It's been armored for a very long time before I started working for the stream program. It's probably
because they don't like to do that now.
Right. We advise against doing riprap because anyone, if you've ever walked along these riprap sections in the summer on a hot day, the stone becomes really, really warm, which is a problem for habitat conditions for aquatic life. So brook trout do not like to hang out near warm waters. Another issue with stone riprap is that without vegetation, they really don't offer any sort of filtration barrier between roadway contaminants sort of running off directly into the stream. So what we did was we worked with the landowner and designed a planting to sort of fill in the gaps between these riprap boulders and overtop the boulders with topsoil and vegetation. So we worked with AMS soil, and they used a blower truck, and we got a blend of topsoil and compost between the boulders and created a layer about 3 to 6 inches thick above it. And then myself and an intern took the hydroseeder and hydroseeded the area with native wildflower seed blend, as well as oat and rye seed. And the photo on the right, you can see the growth after just a few months. This is another example of a CSBI project that we've done. This was for a streamside landowner This project, you can see the before picture on the left. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the photo on the right, you can just barely make out the roof of that home. This was a very willow dense planting, but you can see again, just the amount of ecological succession that happens once you install a riparian buffer. So here are a couple BMPs before you even begin to plant a buffer. I think it's really crucial to have a solid design to your planting. And I highly recommend, I always do a botanical survey of the area. And I also conduct a soil survey and do soil testing before I start putting any plants in the ground. So a botanical survey is very useful to survey the area and get an idea of the growing conditions that are present. I like to make a catalog of every species that I see present alongside the area. And the existing vegetation gives an indication of the growing conditions at the site. And it informs selection of site suitable species. So once you have a list of the species that are present, I like to use the USDA plants database as a great resource for finding the preferred growing conditions of the existing species. And from that, you can get a sense of the range of the growing conditions that are present at that site, and helps you choose plants that are accustomed to the conditions that are already present. Another tool I like to use when I begin surveying the soil of the site is the USDA NRCS Web Soil Survey. If you've never seen this before, I really recommend checking it out. It's free, it's online, and it provides soil survey data across 95% of the US. So chances are, if you're within the US, you can look up either by your address. You can upload a shapefile if you use GIS mapping, or you can enter a nearby hydrologic unit. And you enter it in, and it gives you the taxonomic soil type of that area. And it, you can see here is an example of a soil map that I looked up before I did a planting alongside Rondout Creek. So if you are a soil enthusiast and want to know what types of soil are in your own backyard, you can look it up. It takes 2 seconds, and it's kind of neat to know. So once you have that soil map, the database, the USDA NRCS database, creates a custom soil resource report, and it gives you the soil properties of the soil that you have present. So I utilize this to sort of determine the characteristics of the soil. So for the riparian buffer that I'm planting, I can see within that area if there are certain sub areas that are better naturally suited to filter groundwater or to filter surface water. And again, it's just a really great tool. If you're ever designing a riparian buffer planting, I highly recommend using this resource. And another step that's a little bit more detailed than the soil survey. The soil survey is great if you want a quick and easy step to just touch base with the types of soil that you have. But if you want a more refined detail level, I highly recommend taking soil samples of your site and sending them out for soil analysis by a soil lab. So this is an example of a soil food web report that I received from Harrington Soil Labs for the Stanley CSPI planting that I did last year. And it sort of, it gives you interpretations of the biological life that is present within your soil. So in this case, the bacteria, the protozoa, and the nematode levels were all acceptable, but it highlighted that the fungal levels of the soil were low. And so what you can do is you can take these soil tests and then use them to inform what type of soil amendments you're going to be installing at your planting. So I took this soil food web report and decided that because the fungal levels were low, I was going to use myco-apply endo-ecto powder to support mycorrhizal network density and promote fungal development. And here are a couple BMPs during the process. So once you have the design set, there are a couple different BMPs that you can follow to make sure that your riparian buffer improves the ecological health of your area. And those are to utilize native plants, reduce your mowed areas, and to be soil conscious. So utilizing native plants is one of the best things that you can do if you're planting alongside a stream. Choosing plants that are native to your area means that they will be more resilient than non-native plants. They often need less maintenance than non-native plants, and they also support native fauna. So choosing native plants, in fact, supports native insect biomass, which works its way up the food chain, supporting birds, mammals, and other species. And so using native plants, okay, that's great, but how can I find a list of native species to my area? The New York State DEC offers really great info sheets. Here's an example of one of native species that you can use if you're ever gardening or landscaping. They have sheets on native flowers, native shrubs, native trees. Again, I attached the link to this presentation, but be sure to check it out. It's a really great resource for anyone interested in learning more. Another great tool for finding native plants in your area is the Indigenous Landscapes Native Plant Agriculture Guide. And it is a great guide. I was introduced to it by my coworker, Brendan Wagner. And this guide is very helpful for selecting native species which support the biodiversity that strengthen wildlife food web and address ecological restoration. And what I really like about this guide specifically is that it details specific wildlife fauna that benefit from native plant species. Another BMP that you can follow when installing a riparian buffer is to reduce your mowed areas. This is an example of our CSBI planting along at the Schoenberg site. And the planting is only within the first 100 or so feet alongside the stream edge, but it's important even beyond that planting area to leave the larger stream side buffer unmowed. And this is a great thing that you can do to support insect biomass and native wildlife. And this is, it might be hard to see on your screen, but this was actually a photo taken at the Schoenberg site. And in the red circle, it might be hard to see, but it's a bald eagle that's flying overhead. And you see in unmowed areas a lot more dense and diverse native wildlife. Another BMP that you can follow is to be soil conscious when installing a riparian buffer planting. So I like to think of this as practicing soil care. This is a diagram from RNSP's landowner guides. And I really like this graphic because it shows just how much life is within soil. And it's really important when you're installing your riparian buffer to shy away from harsh chemical fertilizers and be more conscious about how you're amending that soil. So I recommend using compost teas, mycorrhizal based products, things that are going to promote biological soil life, not harm it. As you're planting your riparian buffer, you can also follow these BMPs to promote stabilization along your stream banks. I recommend planting and maintaining a buffer of mature vegetation year-round, and also establishing roots on steep eroding slopes. So we sort of covered this already, but again, you want to keep that dense root network along your stream bank year-round. And a lot of times landowners will say, okay, I have a riparian buffer, but how wide do I need to make it? And the answer I like to give them is, when it comes to buffers, the bigger the better. So the wider your buffer is, the more potential protection you're offering your property during high flood events. And the second BMP that RNSP likes to promote is establishing roots on eroding slopes. This is a picture of some willow fascines that are soaking in water. They were installed alongside our restoration project at Blue Hill Lodge. Willows are a really great resource for adding stability to your riparian buffer. And we use willows in a couple different ways. One of them is willow fascines. And this is photo on the left is our former intern Eden making a bundle of willows, which we call willow fascines. And they're used and laid into the stream bank. And they're excellent because they're very quick growing, and it's a very fast acting approach to promoting stability along your stream bank. So this is a before picture. And then after, I think this was after 2 years of growth. So you can really see how these willow fascines just rapidly root into the stream bank and add stability. Another way, in addition to willow fascines, is we also use willow staking. And instead of having a bundle of willows, a willow staking is just pounding a single willow cutting into the stream bank substrate. And you can see the photo on the right is a willow stake after just 1 year of growth. So it's really an effective tool if you have a stream bank like these that don't have a lot of soil. They're very cobbly, gravelly, pebbly, difficult to grow vegetation. Willow stakes are an excellent resource. Another way of getting vegetation growth on failing hill slopes or stream banks is hydroseeding. This is one of my favorite practices that RNSP does. I love hydroseeding. Again, this was an example of a hydroseeding project that we did last year. Here's another example of us hydroseeding. This was at the Route 55 project alongside Chestnut Creek. And hydroseeding is oftentimes a two-step process. So the first is to apply a layer of proorganics, which really ignite that nutrient cycle in the soil. Here you can see it on a larger scale. This is along the east branch of the Neversink River. I believe this is the Blue Hill Lodge site. And then the second step to hydroseeding is oftentimes applying Flexterra, which really helps adhere to the side of this if you have very steep slopes. And while we use hydroseeding along large-scale CSBI and restoration projects, it's also a really good use for roadside drainage networks. So roadside ditches, if you hydroseed them, you're establishing vegetation with a root network, and that really helps keep that soil in place, which helps prevent fine sediment from being pumped into your streams. And I think it's really great to encourage your local highway supervisors to contact their local county soil and water conservation district and find out what hydroseeding services are available for your area. And to sum things up, just a couple BMPs after you're finished installing your riparian buffer. I highly recommend installing browse protection. So I know in my watershed, deer love to eat CSBI projects. So I highly recommend using either deer fencing or tree tubes, something that's going to keep wildlife from munching your plants, especially during their first few years of growth. I also recommend to water your plantings during the growing season. That can make a really big difference. And also to regularly monitor and manage invasive species spread near your riparian buffer. A lot of times managing invasive species is a lot easier if you catch them early. You don't want to wait for them to spread too large, because then it becomes very expensive and time consuming to manage them. And just to wrap things up, my watershed, our program is outside of the Upper Delaware Council region. We deal with the Rondout-Neversink watersheds, which you can see here outlined in blue, and it's within Sullivan County and Ulster County. But I encourage you to read up on some of those resources that I posted. They can be used by anyone, no matter where you are in the Catskills or the watershed. And thank you. If you have any questions, I'll stick around to answer them. And if you're interested in learning more about the stream program, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and you can also join our mailing list for updates. But I will open up the floor to any questions.
Hmm.
All right.
Billy?
I think Larry, you have a question?
This is
Go for
Larry.
it.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm just curious that I see that hydro seeding quite often. Is it always the same seeds, or can they use variety of seeds in that same application?
That's a really great question. So you can use whatever seeds you want. So you'll fill the hydro seeder up with water, and then you can add a mix of whatever seeds you want to spread. For the Rondout-Neversink Stream Program, we do a custom blend of wildflower species and species that are native and have been sourced from our watersheds. You can also just sow like grass seed. You can sow oat or rye as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. This is Shannon. I really appreciate your presentation. That was great. I know you have a little bit different service area, but I do think the information is really relevant since we have so many property owners on streams and tributaries of the Delaware. So my question would be that you work a lot with private property owners, and we have the majority of property in the Upper Delaware corridor is private property. How do you engage with private property owners and get them to undertake projects like this on their property?
That's a really great question. In our watershed, we've seen a real change in the demographic of landowners, especially after 2020 with the migration of New York City residents up to the area. I think my biggest advice is to know your audience, know your landowner. I think the first step is to just build trust and communication between the landowner and your organization. A lot of the times in the past, it's been difficult for RNSP to have landowners sign on to our programs. But I think the first step and what's worked really well in recent years is to build those relationships with landowners, make sure they know about your program, who you are, what you do, and to just really understand, like, am I reaching out to someone who has lived in this area for generations? Am I contacting someone who has just moved here a few months ago? I think doing research is really helpful in catering your approach to the landowner.
I have a question. This is Fred.
Hi, Fred.
A lot of efforts have been and are continuing to go on up in the Hancock area of tributaries. I don't know if you've heard anything about them. Our friends of the Upper Delaware have engineers going through re-engineering creeks and tributaries to their natural beds. But I think the biggest thing along the river, I'm a riverside owner. I own almost a mile of riverfront down here in Hancock. And I think the biggest thing is knotweed.
Mm.
There is, for all intents and purposes, the strand is knotweed.
Mm-hmm.
And until that's gone, you don't have a beach or a shore unless you go to extreme energies to combat it.
Right.
And are you doing a lot of work in that? I know the Park Service has done some work. A lot of people have done work But there's areas, and I've said this over and over, there's areas where there is no knotweed.
Right.
And then right next to it, same, you would think it was exactly the same. There's knotweed all over the place, but it won't grow in this area.
Right.
And no one's ever given me any kind of solution or anything where they're actually looking into it.
That's a really great question. Japanese knotweed is, like you said, it's highly invasive. Japanese knotweed grows from its network of rhizomes beneath the ground. So what's really difficult with removing Japanese knotweed is it can, if let's say you remove and tear out Japanese knotweed from a bank, if you leave even just a small segment of the plant stem or the plant root, it can actually resprout and grow again. So it's very tricky to deal with. In our watershed, we're very lucky that we have a very low density of Japanese knotweed. But in other sections of the Catskills, particularly along more in the Ashokan Basin, you see very dense Japanese knotweed. And like I said, it's one of those cases where you have to sort of catch it early, because once it establishes itself in the soil, it's very difficult to remove. There are certain agencies that will treat Japanese knotweed. My stream program will treat it for streamside landowners because it is still in a manageable stage. But again, once it has widespread area, it's very expensive and time consuming to treat, especially along waterways, because you see segments and floods or high flow events getting washed downstream. And that's why you see a lot of Japanese knotweed along waterways.
Then what are you doing that everybody else isn't doing? That you have low concentrations.
Yeah, that's the key, is just how concentrated it is. We do the same management technique as you could do anywhere else in the watershed, but it really only makes sense to do that if you'll be able to eradicate it. So if you have a 10-mile section of Japanese knotweed, no matter how often you treat it, it's going to be next to impossible to remove.
I have a question.
Hi.
Have you evaluated the costs for these various BMP approaches?
Just all of them, or a specific one, or?
Well, like, could you give some examples of, say using willow versus using hydroseeding per acre, just the range of the various BMPs?
I don't have a specific range it's very, very cheap to use willow cuttings because we have a willow grove, so we can cut them for free. We do everything in-house for that. So that's one of our low cost options, but it's going to depend on where you're sourcing the willows from, if you're installing them yourself or hiring a crew to do that. But for our projects, we do a cost analysis on which projects get priority. So ranking that cost versus benefit. If that answers your question, we more do a cost analysis on a project base rather than our BMP practices.
Okay, thanks.
Question?
Hi.
Getting back to the knotweed, is there any plantings that could replace? I was on the river just this week, and there were sections where the knotweed, of course, it eliminates all the ground cover,
Mm-hmm.
and the soil's exposed. And high waters like we've just recently had, the soil on its way to Philadelphia. Is there anything that would be as strong or as, to match the power of the knotweed to take over an area? Is there anything? So for an example, could you do a willow planting where there's knotweed, and would that shade out the knotweed, which is shading out the ground cover already?
That's a really great question. So it sounds like you're sort of asking if there's a like a biological control for dealing
Yes.
with Japanese knotweed. In my experience, I haven't seen an effective biological control for it. So I don't know of any native vegetation that would grow as aggressively enough to shade out Japanese knotweed. And what's really tricky is because they have that horizontal rhizome network beneath the ground, Japanese knotweed, they can actually extend like 30 to 40 feet horizontally. They have a horizontal spread of 30 to 40 feet from that stem. So let's say you put an umbrella directly over the Japanese knotweed, it can shoot out suckers using its network in a very wide spread. So it's difficult to shade out Japanese knotweed with the biocontrol. But if you hear of any methods, please let me know because I would be interested.
The same, if you hear of any, let us know.
Let's keep each other posted.
Thank you. Good presentation. Okay.
Those are all great